3 months after the partnership agreement was signed, humanity faced its first major test when a territorial dispute between the Kryn Empire and the Mantis Confederation escalated from political arguments to actual military mobilization, and both sides had moved their battle fleets to a contested region called the Epsilon Cluster, and the situation was becoming very dangerous because neither side was willing to back down and war seemed likely. In the Council's war room, which was a special chamber where military commanders from different species planned defensive strategies, Captain Daniel Cross stood beside Admiral Peter Hall, who had traveled all the way from Earth specifically to help with this crisis, and they were now full participants in Council military planning instead of observers standing in the corner. Premier Voth explained the situation to everyone in the room, and he said that the Kryn claimed they had historical rights to the Epsilon Cluster based on ancient exploration records from thousands of years ago, while the Mantis argued that they had current inhabitation and active development of the region, and both sides had legitimate arguments under Council law, and both refused to compromise on their positions. Commander Zelf added that the standard Council procedure would be to send an arbitration fleet to enforce a ceasefire while negotiations took place, but the problem was that both the Kryn and the Mantis had stated publicly that they would view any Council military presence as evidence that the Council was supporting their opponent, and this created a deadlock, because sending ships might start a war, and not sending ships might also allow a war to begin. Admiral Hall studied the tactical displays in silence, and his experienced eyes traced the patrol patterns and fleet positions, and he looked at the numbers and the distances and the strategic choke points, and after a long period of careful observation, he finally spoke and asked how many ships each side currently had deployed in the cluster area. A luminary officer reported that the Kryn had 47 vessels with heavy weapons configurations, and the Mantis had 63 vessels that were lighter but more maneuverable, and Hall then asked about the size of the Council's proposed arbitration fleet and was told it would consist of 25 ships with mixed capabilities, and Hall shook his head and said that this was insufficient. He explained that an arbitration fleet of 25 ships would be outgunned by either side, which made it a target instead of a deterrent, and this was exactly why the standard Council procedure was failing in this situation, because the Council was trying to use the same old methods for a problem that required a different approach. Premier Voth asked if Admiral Hall had an alternative suggestion, and his tone was genuinely interested rather than dismissive, and Hall said yes, he had a different idea, and instead of sending a fleet directly into the conflict zone, the Council should send a message through strategic positioning. Karen Bell stepped forward and activated a different tactical display, and she explained a concept from human military doctrine called strategic positioning. And she said that instead of massing forces directly where the conflict was happening, you position them at critical infrastructure points like supply lines and communication hubs and resource extraction facilities. Senator Nix sounded skeptical when he said that this would be threatening their logistics and that such a move could be seen as an act of war. But Daniel corrected him and explained that they would position near the logistics routes but not actually threaten anything explicitly, and they would simply establish a visible presence that both sides would have to factor into their calculations. Admiral Hall expanded the tactical map and pointed to several locations, and he said here and here and here, with quick decisive gestures, and he explained that human vessels could be in position at these strategic points in 18 hours, and they would not be in the Epsilon Cluster itself, but adjacent to critical jump points and supply routes, and the message would be clear, without being confrontational. Hall continued by saying that they were not taking sides, and they were not blocking anything, but what they were doing was making the cost of war higher than the cost of negotiation, because if the Kryn and Mantis decided to fight each other, they would also have to worry about protecting their supply chains from potential disruption. But if they chose to negotiate instead, all those concerns would disappear. Commander Zelf's crystalline body pulsed with thought patterns, and he said that this was like a blockade without actually blocking anything, and it was pressure without direct confrontation, and after a moment of consideration, he admitted that it was actually a clever approach. Premier Voth asked if Hall thought this strategy would work, and Hall gave an honest answer and said it depended on how committed both sides were to actually fighting, because most territorial disputes were not worth real bloodshed, once the reality and cost of war became concrete instead of theoretical, and right now everything was just posturing and threats. But human positioning would make the situation real, and suddenly negotiation would look much more attractive than combat. The council debated the proposal for 2 hours, and there were many concerns and questions. But eventually they agreed to try humanity's approach instead of the standard procedure that had already been rejected by both sides, and within 1 day, 16 human vessels had moved into strategic positions surrounding the Epsilon Cluster, and they did not broadcast threats or issue demands, but simply held their positions and ran their standard operations in a way that was visible and undeniable. On the Kryn flagship, Commander Thrax looked at the new tactical situation with growing frustration, and he demanded to know why the human ships were positioned where they were, and his tactical officer reported that the humans claimed they were conducting routine patrol operations. But the positioning was clearly deliberate, because if the Kryn engaged the Mantis in battle, they would have to leave their supply routes vulnerable or divert ships to guard them. Thrax made an angry sound and pointed out that the humans were not even in the Epsilon Cluster, and they were not actually interfering with anything, but his officer explained that the problem was they were making the Kryn think about logistics and supply chains, and fighting a war without secure supply lines would be very problematic and potentially disastrous. The Mantis leadership was having the exact same conversation and facing the same calculations, and within 48 hours of the human deployment, both sides quietly and privately requested council mediation to help resolve their dispute, and they made these requests not because they were forced to, but because continuing the military standoff had suddenly become less appealing than finding a diplomatic solution. Ambassador Kren conducted the negotiations personally, and Captain Daniel Cross served as a consulting advisor who offered suggestions when appropriate, and the settlement process took 3 full weeks to finalize. But eventually an agreement was reached, and the Epsilon Cluster was divided based on actual development and current use, rather than ancient historical claims, and both sides gained formal recognition of their holdings and accepted the compromise, and most importantly, no shots had been fired and no lives had been lost. In the council chambers, Premier Voth addressed the full assembly, and he formally recognized that the Borderlands conflict had been resolved peacefully, thanks in large part to innovative human strategy and tactical thinking, and the council officially acknowledged the effectiveness of humanity's contributions, and this was the first time the council had publicly praised human methods instead of dismissing them. But not everyone was celebrating this success, and after the public session ended, a group of traditionalist council members met in a private secured conference room, and the group included Senator Nix and Commander Zelf and 4 other species, who were uncomfortable with how quickly humanity was gaining influence and respect. Commander Zelf said that this was exactly what he had feared would happen, and he pointed out that humans had been in space for barely a century, yet they were already reshaping council military doctrine, and he argued that council methods had maintained peace for thousands of years and should not be abandoned so quickly. Senator Nix, who had supported the partnership agreement, now voiced concerns about the speed of change, and he said that human methods had prevented a war, that traditional council approaches might not have stopped, but he questioned whether humanity was gaining too much influence too fast. Ambassador Trell, who represented the ancient Carusian Dominion, warned that the pace would only accelerate, and he explained that humanity had something the council lacked, which was urgency, and humans innovated rapidly because they had no investment in preserving tradition, and every success would make them bolder and more confident. Zelf spoke carefully and suggested that perhaps humanity needed to experience failure at some point, because this would remind them that youth and innovation were not always superior to age and wisdom, and Senator Nix looked uncomfortable and asked what exactly Zelf was suggesting. Zelf said he was not suggesting anything overt, but he pointed out that opportunities would arise where situations might occur that were not suitable for human methods, and the group could simply ensure that those particular situations received proper attention from the council, and the meeting ended without any formal agreement, but dangerous seeds had been planted. 8 months after his humiliating dismissal, Captain Daniel Cross walked back into the council chambers, but everything looked different now, because the room had been completely reconfigured, and instead of the old hierarchical arrangement where species sat in different levels based on their age and importance, there was now a circular table in the center of the chamber where all species were represented at the same height, and this simple change in furniture said more about the shift in attitudes than any words could express. Premier Voth stood up to greet Daniel as he entered, and this was an honor that had never been given to a human before, and Voth said thank you for coming, and his tone was respectful rather than mocking, and Daniel nodded and said that he noticed. They had redecorated, and there was a slight edge of sarcasm in his voice, but if Voth caught it, he did not show any reaction, and he simply gestured for Daniel to take a seat at the table. Around the circular table sat representatives from 30 major council species, and some of them looked genuinely curious about what would happen next, while others appeared skeptical and a few looked openly hostile, but none of them were laughing. And that was the most important difference from before, and Lieutenant Karen Bell took her place beside Daniel, with her data tablets ready, and she was prepared to present evidence and arguments if needed. Ambassador Kren spoke first, and his insectoid translator made soft clicking sounds as he said that the Council wished to formally acknowledge that humanity's contributions to galactic stability had been significant and underappreciated, and Daniel repeated the word underappreciated as if testing how it tasted, and he said it was an interesting choice of words, but his expression remained neutral. Senator Nix shifted uncomfortably in his seat and said that the Council may have been premature in their assessments of human capabilities, and Karen responded bluntly by saying that the Council had mocked humans at every session and every proposal, and every offer of assistance had been treated as if humans were ignorant children, begging for approval. And Daniel did not stop her from speaking because everything she said was true. The chamber grew tense, and Commander Zelf's crystalline form flickered with different colors as he spoke, and he said that the Council was ancient and had been operating for millions of years, while humanity had only been in space for less than a century. And surely humans could understand why the Council had been skeptical, and Daniel replied that they had expected skepticism, but what they received was contempt, and there was a very big difference between caution and insult. Premier Voth raised one of his clawed hands to calm the situation, and he said that perhaps they could move past talking about the past and focus on discussing the future, because the Council had experienced many difficulties during humanity's absence, and they wanted to establish a formal framework for cooperation. And Daniel said that cooperation was a nice word, but they needed to be very specific about what that meant. Daniel stood up from his seat and walked over to the chamber's central display system, and he activated a holographic map that showed all of Council space, and he marked certain areas in red to show zones of increased piracy, and yellow zones showed trade disruptions, and blue zones indicated diplomatic tensions between species, and he explained that this was what the galaxy looked like without human involvement. He pointed out that 8 months ago, most of the map had been green, which meant stable and secure, and he said that humans had not accomplished this stability by using massive military fleets or heavy-handed diplomacy, but by showing up consistently and being reliable and solving small problems before they became large ones, and this was the value that humanity brought to the galaxy. Premier Voth said that humans wanted recognition for their work, and it was not phrased as a question but as a statement, and Daniel surprised everyone by saying no, because recognition was not what they wanted, and what they actually wanted was real partnership, and not the kind where humans did all the work, while the Council took credit, and not the kind where humans offered solutions, and the Council laughed at their primitive ways, but actual partnership where human voices mattered and human input was valued and human methods were respected. Karen activated a series of data streams on the holographic display, and she explained that these were humanity's proposals, and she laid out 3 main points. And first was that human vessels would resume security operations in designated sectors, but under human command protocols and not Council oversight, and they would coordinate with the Council but not subordinate themselves to Council authority. And second was that human trade operations would resume, but with formal economic recognition and fair treatment in tariff policies. And third was that human diplomatic personnel would assist in mediation, but as independent arbitrators, and not as Council functionaries who followed rigid protocols. Senator Nix observed that what humans were asking for was significant autonomy, and Daniel countered by saying that they were asking for what actually worked, because Council protocols and ancient hierarchies were inefficient, and humans had already proven that their methods were effective, and the Council needed to trust humans to operate in areas where they had expertise. Commander Zelf asked about military cooperation, and specifically whether humans still wanted to be included in the Outer Rim Defense Initiative that they had requested months ago, and Daniel confirmed that yes, they still wanted to participate. but not as junior partners or observers but as full collaborative members where human tactical innovations would be combined with council resources and experience to create an actual alliance instead of a mentorship program that humanity did not need. The council members exchanged glances with each other, and there was a long pause before Premier Voth spoke carefully, and he said that what humans were proposing would elevate humanity to a status that typically took civilizations thousands of years to achieve. And Daniel replied quietly that perhaps the council's timetable needed adjustment because age did not automatically equal capability. Daniel pointed out that the Kryn Empire had been traveling through space for 10,000 years, yet pirates evaded their patrols with ease, and the Luminary had mastered energy manipulation, but their economic systems had nearly collapsed without human logistics support. And he said that wisdom came from experience, yes, but also from humility and the ability to adapt to new situations, and Ambassador Kren made a clicking sound that his translator rendered as laughter. And he said that the human was speaking truth that made the council uncomfortable. Premier Voth proposed a trial period of 6 months where human vessels would resume operations under the conditions that had been specified, and then the council would evaluate the results and meet again to decide on permanent arrangements. But Daniel said no very firmly, and the room went completely still, and he explained that there would be no trial periods and no probationary status because either the council accepted humans as full partners right now, or humanity would maintain their current withdrawn position and they would not audition for approval again. The silence that followed was heavy and tense, and Karen watched Daniel's face knowing that this was the calculated risk they had discussed and prepared for, and this was the final push that would either result in genuine respect or burn every bridge between humanity and the council, and there would be no middle ground and no compromise on this point. Finally, Ambassador Kren spoke up and said that he supported granting full partnership status to humanity because they had proven their worth in ways that mattered far more than age or tradition. And slowly, one by one, other ambassadors began voicing their positions, and some agreed enthusiastically while others agreed reluctantly, and some remained silent in disapproval. But when the vote was finally called, the result was 31 species in favor of full partnership with 16 opposed, or abstaining. It was not unanimous, but it was a clear majority. And Premier Voth stood up, and his massive frame somehow seemed less imposing than it had been at the beginning of the meeting. And he said that it was decided and humanity would be granted full partnership status within the Galactic Council, with all rights and privileges and responsibilities that came with that status. And he formally welcomed Captain Cross to the True Council, where humans would now have an equal voice. Daniel extended his hand in the human gesture of agreement and greeting, and Voth hesitated for just a moment before gripping Daniel's hand with his clawed hand and being careful not to apply too much pressure, and cameras captured this moment as the first truly equal handshake between humanity and the council leadership, and the image would be transmitted across the galaxy within hours. As Daniel and Karen left the chamber, Karen whispered that they had done it and they had achieved actual partnership instead of token participation. But Daniel replied that words on paper were easy, and the real test would be what happened next, because they would need to prove that human methods actually worked and that the Council's decision to accept them had been the right choice. On Earth, Admiral Peter Hall received the transmission about the negotiation results, and he allowed himself a rare smile, and he sent orders across all of human space saying that protocol silence was officially ended and all human vessels should resume normal operations, but he added that they would now operate on humanity's terms and as equals. 6 months had passed since humanity had withdrawn from all council activities, and what had started as small inconveniences had grown into real problems that affected hundreds of worlds and thousands of species across the galaxy, and the council was facing challenges that they had not dealt with in centuries because all the little tasks that humans had been quietly handling were now left undone, and nobody else seemed able or willing to fill those gaps. The Kryn Empire and the Luminary Collective had gotten into a serious disagreement about who owned the rights to mine valuable minerals in a region called the Theta Sector. And normally, such disputes were handled through mediation sessions where neutral diplomats would help both sides find a compromise, but the human mediators who used to conduct these sessions were gone, and without them the two sides just kept arguing and getting angrier, and what should have been a simple negotiation turned into a military standoff with both sides sending warships to the disputed area. On the trade world of Mercantis, the economy had fallen into a recession, and many small businesses were failing because they could no longer afford to buy the equipment and technology they needed to compete with the big corporations and human manufacturers had been selling affordable computers and tools to these small traders for years, and this had allowed them to stay in business and serve their communities. But now that humans were gone, the prices had gone way up, and dozens of shops and stores had to close their doors, and riots broke out in the merchant quarters because people were angry and scared about losing their livelihoods. In the Outer Rim territories, pirate activity had increased by 300%, and the raiders were getting bolder because they knew that council fleets were slow and predictable and easy to avoid, and the human patrol ships had maintained a constant and unpredictable presence that kept the pirates guessing about where they might show up next. But council fleets operated on rigid schedules that never changed, and the pirates quickly figured out the patterns and simply avoided those areas and attacked everywhere else, and colonies that had been safe and prosperous under quiet human protection now lived in constant fear of raids. Senator Nix finally called an emergency session of the council, and he stood before all the assembled species and said that they could no longer pretend that everything was fine and that humanity's absence was not affecting them, because the evidence was overwhelming and the problems were getting worse every day, and he said the council had to address the human situation directly and figure out what to do about it. Premier Voth looked tired and his scales seemed duller than before, and he agreed that they should send an official message to Earth and ask the humans what they wanted and what it would take to bring them back to the council. And so, a message was carefully written using proper diplomatic language, and it said that the Galactic Council requested clarification about humanity's recent withdrawal, and that they wished to understand human concerns and find a path forward that would work for everyone. Admiral Peter Hall read the message in his office on Earth, surrounded by his senior staff, and Colonel Amy Wright watched his face carefully to see how he would react, and she asked if they should send a response, but Hall said no, because an inquiry was not an invitation, and the council was still treating humans like children who needed to explain their behavior instead of partners who deserved respect, and he ordered that protocol silence should remain in effect. 2 weeks later, the council sent another message, and this one was slightly less formal and more direct, and it acknowledged that certain disruptions had occurred during humanity's absence, and said that the council was willing to discuss adjustments to protocols regarding how humans participated in council activities. And this message sat on Hall's desk for 3 days before he finally replied with just 2 words, which were not enough. Premier Voth was furious when he learned that humans had barely responded to the council's attempts at communication, and he roared in the council chambers that this was intolerable behavior and that humans were acting like spoiled children who were not getting their way. But Ambassador Kren, who had been studying human history very carefully, spoke up and said that what they were seeing was not childish behavior, but something humans called a strike. Kren explained that in human history, when a group of workers felt undervalued, they would stop working to demonstrate how important their contributions were, and this was exactly what humanity was doing now. And they were showing the council what the galaxy looked like without human help, and Voth demanded to know if Kren thought the council should beg the humans to come back. And Kren replied that perhaps the council should consider whether they had been taking human contributions for granted. Commander Zelf's crystalline body glowed bright with anger, and he said that the Galactic Council had maintained peace and prosperity for millions of years, and that they did not need lectures from a species that was barely a century old. But Kren interrupted him, which was very unusual because Kren was normally very polite and respectful of protocol, and Kren asked if the Council had really been maintaining peace, or if humans had been doing it while the Council took credit. The chamber erupted in outrage, and many species started shouting at once, but Kren kept talking over the noise, and he presented data that he had been collecting for months, and the numbers showed that in sectors where human ships patrolled piracy had decreased by 74%, and in trade lanes served by human carriers on time deliveries had increased by 63%, and in disputes mediated by human diplomats resolution time had been cut in half, and these were not small or insignificant contributions, no matter what the council wanted to believe. Premier Voth tried to dismiss the data by saying that these were minor support functions that did not justify such dramatic behavior from humanity. But then something happened that nobody expected, and a research station called Helios 7 sent out an emergency distress signal saying that their reactor was failing, and would explode in less than 4 hours, and 300 people were on that station, including scientists from 19 different council species and the nearest council. Rescue ship was 6 hours away, which meant that everyone on Helios 7 would die unless someone closer could help them. In Earth's command center, alarms started blaring as the automated systems picked up the distress call, and Lieutenant Karen Bell ran to Admiral Hall's office and told him that Helios 7 needed immediate evacuation support, and Hall asked where. The nearest human ship was located, and Karen said it was the Earth carrier Hampton, which was only 42 minutes away, and the captain was Ryan Boyd, who was requesting permission to assist with the rescue. Hall stood very still for a long moment, and everyone in the command center was watching him and waiting for his decision. Because protocol silence had been absolute and breaking, it would send a message that humanity could be moved by emergencies, and that the council could keep ignoring them and just call when disasters happened. But 300 innocent people were about to die, and these were scientists and researchers who had never mocked humanity or treated them with contempt, and they did not deserve to die because of politics. Hall finally gave permission for the Hampton to assist, but he told Karen to send a message to the council as well. And the message said that humanity would always answer distress calls, because that was who humans were, and they would always help people in danger. But this was not a resumption of normal relations, and when the council was ready to speak with humans as equals, they would know where to find them. Captain Ryan Boyd and his crew on the Hampton arrived at Helios 7 with 17 minutes to spare, before the reactor would have exploded, and they executed a perfect emergency evacuation that was practiced and precise, and they pulled all 300 station personnel to safety, just moments before the reactor breach destroyed the station, and the rescue was so well done that it demonstrated the exact level of skill and training that the council had dismissed as primitive and inadequate. In the council chambers, the rescued scientists came to give testimony about what had happened, and a luminary researcher named Kellen spoke with obvious emotion in his voice, and he said that the human crew had shown extraordinary skill and courage, and had risked their own lives and their ship to save everyone, and he said that without the humans they would all be dead, and several other scientists echoed his words and thanked humanity for their help. For the first time in months, the council chamber was completely silent as the members sat and thought about what they had just heard, and they realized that humanity had sent a very clear message, and humans would help in emergencies because that was the right thing to do, but they would not return to being dismissed and ignored and treated like incompetent children who did not deserve respect. Premier Voth spoke slowly, and his voice was different from before, and he said that the council had to make a decision about whether to continue as they had been, or to acknowledge that perhaps they had misjudged humanity and their value. And Ambassador Kren immediately proposed that the council should invite human representatives to come for real negotiations, and not to hear them beg for scraps, but to discuss genuine partnership on equal terms. Commander Zelf asked what would happen if the humans refused the 3 weeks passed, and the council was busy with their usual work of making laws and settling disputes between different species and managing trade agreements, and nobody had officially mentioned the fact that all the human representatives were gone and the human seats remained empty day after day. But Ambassador Kren finally raised the question during a routine meeting about trade regulations, and he asked if anyone had heard from the human delegation, because their absence had now lasted for 21 standard days. And this was unusual even for humans who usually attended every session even when they were ignored. Premier Voth waved one of his clawed hands in a dismissive gesture and said that perhaps the humans had finally realized that they were wasting their time by constantly trying to get approval for things they were not ready to handle, and he suggested that the council should simply move on to more important topics because there were many pressing issues that needed attention, and most of the council members agreed with him, and the meeting continued as if nothing was wrong. But the absence was not limited to just meeting rooms and government halls, because human trade vessels had stopped showing up at docking stations across council space, and merchants who had relied on human ships to transport their goods were now struggling to find alternatives. And on the merchant world of Talaris 5, a trader named Plex complained loudly to anyone who would listen that his business was suffering, because human freighters had always delivered his products on time and at reasonable prices, but now he had to use Kryn transport ships that charged 3 times as much, and were often late with deliveries. Similar complaints began appearing in reports from different parts of council space, and the economic networks that connected all the different worlds started showing small disruptions that grew larger each day, and human goods like advanced computers and medical equipment became harder to find in the markets, and prices started going up because there was less supply and more demand. And store owners were frustrated because they had come to depend on the steady flow of human products that were affordable and reliable. On a research station that orbited a planet called Lumina 3, a scientist named Vera, who belonged to the Luminari species, found herself unable to complete her project because the human research team that had been helping her had suddenly left, and they had been working on a new type of sensor array that could detect distant objects more accurately. And the humans had contributed ideas about sensor integration that nobody else on the team had thought of. And when they left, they took their knowledge with them, and Vera could not figure out how to fill the gaps they had left behind. Her colleague, Toran, who was known for being very logical and methodical, reviewed all the data and notes that the humans had left, and he observed that everything was properly organized, and all their findings had been transferred up to the point of their departure, and it seemed like they had planned their exit very carefully and had made sure not to leave any mess behind. But they also had not shared their future plans or explained why they were leaving. At the administrative center on Prime Station, which was the main hub of council operations, bureaucrats and officials started noticing more gaps in their daily operations, and human mediators who had been helping to resolve small disputes between different species were no longer available, and human technical staff who had maintained certain computer systems and equipment had gone home, leaving only instruction manuals, but no actual people to call when something went wrong. And human medical volunteers who had been working at relief stations in poor regions had all returned to their own worlds. Senator Nix brought up the issue again during a council session that took place 6 weeks after the humans had disappeared, and he said that perhaps someone should contact Earth and ask about the situation because the absence of humans was starting to cause problems that could not be ignored. And he listed several examples of disruptions in trade and research and administration, and he suggested that the council should at least inquire about when the humans planned to return. Commander Zelf responded by saying that the disruptions were minor and temporary, and that the galaxy had functioned perfectly well for millions of years before humans had arrived, and it would continue to function just fine without them, and he said that if humans wanted to isolate themselves in their corner of space, then the council should let them, because it was not worth worrying about such a young and insignificant species. But then something happened that made even the most dismissive council members pay attention, and a colony world called Taraxis, which was home to settlers from Aquaria Prime, sent out an urgent distress call saying that pirates had attacked their supply convoys and destroyed several ships, and the colony was asking for immediate military protection because their own defenses were not strong enough to handle organized pirate raids. This type of emergency was not particularly unusual, because the outer regions of council space saw occasional attacks from raiders and criminals who tried to steal cargo or demand ransom payments. But what made this situation different was that the human patrol ships that normally helped secure that sector of space were nowhere to be found, and the colony had become used to seeing human vessels pass through regularly, and the presence of those ships had kept most pirates away because the humans had a reputation for responding quickly to any signs of trouble. Premier Voth immediately ordered a Kryn battle group to go to Taraxis and help defend the colony, but the battle group was currently stationed very far away, and it would take 2 full weeks to reach the endangered world, and the governor of Taraxis sent desperate messages saying that 2 weeks might be too long and that people would die if help did not arrive sooner, but there were no other council fleets close enough to respond faster. Voth tried to reassure the council members that this was exactly why they had official protocols and procedures, and he said that random patrols by individual species like the humans created false dependencies, and that proper council military fleets would handle all security matters in an organized and efficient manner. But the truth was that council fleets were designed for large-scale conflicts and major wars, and they were not set up to handle the constant small-scale peacekeeping that the vast territory required. 14 days later, when the Kryn battle group finally arrived at Taraxis, they found a colony that had suffered terrible damage, and 7 freighters had been completely destroyed, and many buildings and facilities were in ruins, and 38 colonists had been killed in the attacks, and the survivors were angry and frightened, and they demanded to know why help had taken so long to arrive. In the council chambers, Ambassador Kren spoke in a soft voice, but his words carried weight, and he pointed out that human ships used to patrol the sector where Taraxis was located, and those patrols had kept the pirates away for more than 2 years. And now that the humans were gone, the raiders had returned and innocent people had died, and he asked where the human vessels were now, and why they were not helping anymore. Admiral Peter Hall stood in the command center on Earth watching the displays that showed every human military ship and where it was positioned, and all the vessels had been pulled back to human-controlled space, and they formed a defensive perimeter around the 52 colony worlds and 300 outposts that belonged to humanity, and not a single ship crossed beyond that boundary into Council territory. Colonel Amy Wright approached Hall with a stack of reports, and she told him that they were receiving many requests from Council worlds asking about human patrol schedules, and some messages were even begging for humans to resume their security routes, and she asked what Hall wanted to do about these requests. Hall gave a simple order, and he said to log every request and send polite replies explaining that all human vessels were currently assigned to protecting human interests, and that anyone who needed security assistance should contact the Council. Military Command, which was responsible for defending Council space, and Colonel Wright understood that this was the entire point of protocol silence, and humans would no longer fill the gaps that the Council had pretended did not exist. On Luna Base, which orbited Earth's moon, Captain Daniel Cross reviewed intelligence reports with Lieutenant Karen Bell, and the data showed increasing chaos in the sectors where humans used to maintain a presence, and pirate activity had increased by 40% in just a few months, and minor disputes between different species were getting worse, because there were no neutral mediators to help resolve conflicts before they escalated, and trade routes were becoming unreliable, because human carriers were no longer available to transport goods efficiently. Karen shook her head and said that the Council still did not understand what was happening, and they thought humans were just being childish and stubborn. But Daniel replied that it did not matter what the Council thought right now, because eventually, reality would teach them what words and presentations could never accomplish. And he said that sometimes the best teacher was absence, and people only learned to value something after they lost it. In the Council chambers, the debates were getting more heated as 3 months passed since humanity had gone silent, and the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore, and economic problems were. Daniel Cross stood in front of the massive doors that led into the Council chambers, and he felt his heart beating faster than usual, because today was another day where he would try to convince the alien species that humans deserved a place among them. But deep down he knew what was coming because it had happened so many times before that he could predict every insult and every dismissive gesture that would follow his presentation. And behind him stood Karen Bell, who carried all the data and information they had prepared about human military tactics and strategies that could help the Council protect the outer regions of the galaxy from pirates and raiders who had been causing trouble for months now, but nobody seemed to care about human suggestions or human ideas, because to them humans were just children who had barely learned to walk among the stars. The doors opened with a soft sound, and Daniel walked into the chamber, where 47 different alien species sat in their designated spots, and each species had a position based on how old their civilization was and how much they had contributed to the galaxy over thousands and thousands of years, and humanity sat at the very bottom, because they had only been part of this council for 3 years. And in those 3 years, they had never been given a real chance to prove themselves, because every time they tried to speak or suggest something, the older species would laugh or make jokes about how young and inexperienced humans were compared to them. Premier Voth stood at the center podium, and he was a tall reptilian creature from the Kryn Empire, and his scales were dark green and his eyes were yellow and cold, and when he looked at Daniel there was nothing but contempt in his gaze, and he announced to everyone that the human delegation wanted to speak again, and his voice carried a tone that made it clear he thought this was a waste of time, and the other council members started laughing even before Daniel could say a single word, because they already knew what he would ask for and they had already decided to say no. Daniel took a deep breath and began speaking about how humanity wanted to help with the defense of the Outer Rim territories, and how they had developed new combat tactics that could reduce response times and save lives, and he explained that human ships were fast and human crews were well trained, and they could patrol areas that were currently being ignored by the larger council fleets. But before he could finish his sentence, Commander Zelf interrupted him, and Zelf was a being made of living crystal that glowed with different colors when he spoke. And he asked Daniel how humans who had been in space for less than 100 years could possibly teach anything to civilizations that had been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years. Karen stepped forward and tried to support Daniel by explaining that human simulations showed clear improvements in patrol efficiency and that asymmetric warfare tactics could be very effective against pirates who used hit-and-run strategies. But her words were cut short by Premier Voth, who started laughing so hard that his whole body shook, and he said that humans talking about warfare was amusing because they had killed millions of their own kind in their last global war. And now, they wanted to teach peaceful species how to fight, and the entire chamber erupted in laughter. And Daniel felt his face getting hot with anger and embarrassment, but he kept his expression calm, because showing emotion would only make things worse. Senator Nix, who was an amphibious creature from Aquaria Prime, suggested that maybe humans needed to wait 500 years before they could apply again for any real responsibilities, and he said this would give humanity time to grow up and learn how to be civilized. And the suggestion was put to a vote immediately without any real discussion, and the result was 46 species voting against humanity, and only one species abstaining from the vote, and that one species was Ambassador Kren, who was an insect-like being from a peaceful world called Vela, and he never voted for or against humans, but he never laughed at them either. Daniel and Karen left the chamber in silence, and as they walked down the long corridor, Karen finally spoke and said that their data had shown a 30% improvement in response times, but nobody had even looked at the information. And Daniel nodded and told her that the council members never looked at human data, because they had already decided that humans had nothing valuable to offer. And he stopped at a large window that showed the stars in the distance, and he wondered how long humanity would have to keep begging for respect that would never come. Back on Earth in the headquarters of the Unified Earth Defense Command, Admiral Peter Hall received the message from Daniel about another failed attempt to gain council approval, and he sat in his office for a long time thinking about what to do next, because 3 years of trying to work with the council had led nowhere, and humans were still being treated like stupid children who did not understand how the galaxy worked, and his senior officers were waiting for his decision about what humanity should do next. Colonel Amy Wright, who was in charge of tactical operations, asked Admiral Hall what orders he wanted to give, and Hall looked at the star maps on his walls that showed 52 human colony worlds and 300 human outposts spread across their small section of space, and he thought about all the times human ships had helped council worlds with security and trade and medical aid, and how none of that seemed to matter to the council because they only cared about how old a civilization was and not what that civilization could actually do. Admiral Hall finally spoke, and his voice was quiet but firm, and he said that humanity had spent 3 years asking for permission and begging for approval, and trying to prove themselves worthy, according to rules that were designed to keep them powerless, and he said it was time to stop asking and time to stop speaking, and Colonel Wright looked confused and asked what he meant, and Hall explained that if the council would not listen to human words, then perhaps they would notice human silence. Within hours, every human ambassador and every human delegate and every human representative received an encrypted message with orders to execute Protocol Silence. And this protocol had been prepared months ago as a contingency plan in case the Council continued to refuse humanity a real voice, and the orders were simple and clear, and every human official was to leave their posts and return home, and every human ship was to stop taking contracts from Council worlds, and every human volunteer and every human worker was to politely excuse themselves and go back to human-controlled space. As the galactic day cycle began again, the Council prepared for their routine meetings and sessions, but something was different, and all the human seats were empty. And at first, nobody noticed, because humans were so used to being ignored that their absence did not seem important, but as days turned into weeks, the empty seats became more and more obvious, and some council members started asking questions about where the humans had gone. But Premier Voth dismissed these concerns and said that humans had probably given up and gone home, and he said this was actually good because it meant the council could focus on more important matters. But the absence was spreading beyond just empty seats in meeting rooms, because human trade ships had stopped accepting new contracts, and human medical teams had left their posts at aid stations, and human technical workers had returned to Earth. And slowly the council began to notice that something was missing, even though they could not quite identify what it was. And Admiral Hall watched from Earth as the galaxy started to experience life without human help, and he wondered how long it would take before the council understood what they had lost. The silence had begun, and humanity waited to see if absence would teach the lesson that presence could not.